Excellent. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone for adapting to our new situation. Jason and I were both originally going to be presenters when these were in-person meetings, but logistically, it made more sense for just one of us to present. So, yeah, I was gonna make a joke right before lunch that I had the coveted pre-lunch spot where everybody is already tuning out and thinking about what's coming up, but instead I get the slightly less coveted immediately after lunch spot where everyone's probably starting to doze off. So I'll do my best to move through this, maybe get us a little bit closer to schedule, and maybe keep you guys entertained. I'm here to talk about a semi-novel approach that's just getting off the ground in Idaho. As Tom mentioned in his introduction this morning, there's really a saying that there's not really such thing as a new idea, and that may be mostly true for this. We're actually, I would say we're a compendium of a bunch of ideas that have been floating around, and they've all aligned correctly to where we're able to get a semi-novel approach off the ground. As you can see, we've titled this the Cheatgrass Challenge. Next slide, please. It's a snappy name, but we're not just talking about cheatgrass here. We're talking about our typical invasive annual grasses, Medusa head, ventonata, and cheatgrass. Just invasive annual grasses didn't have as catchy of a name. And I'm sure most people probably rolled their eyes or cringed when I said cheatgrass. You know, at this point, it's a pervasive threat in the Western U.S. That most people have just learned to live with. But cheatgrass is still expanding, and it's still taking over Idaho's rangelands, increasing wildfire size and frequency, reducing forage productivity, and threatening wildlife habitat in rural economies. As though not as pervasive or well known, other annual grasses like Medusa head and ventonata may be even more problematic if left unchecked. In short, all of these grasses increase our fire risk and decrease forage and habitat to both livestock and wildlife. Next slide, please. And so, like I alluded to, you know, it's a cheatgrass and invasive annual grasses are pervasive. And so a lot of people have thrown their hands up in the air and said, it is what it is. But there's people who are still at it. And one of the questions we want to address is why haven't these past efforts been working? Well, if we think about cheatgrass or invasive annual grasses as a bus that we are all trying to push, we all agree it's stuck and we want to move it. One of the issues we're having is everyone's pushing a bus, but it's not the same bus. So everyone's working in these rangelands trying to address the cheatgrass challenge, but we're all shotgunning approach. So if we were able to all get behind the same bus one at a time and push those buses out, those cheatgrass issues, those invasive annual grass issues out, we'd probably have a larger success. More hands make light work. However, until such time that we do that, you know, we're reacting to what would we call them? Emergencies on the rangeland where we have a problem here, let's get after it. And while we're over there, something else is going on. And so we need to start focusing in our plan of attack and stopping the wholesale conversion of sagebrush rangelands. So that means we have to start thinking differently. So a shout out to Lindy Garner and Jeremy Maestas. If you go to the next slide, please. We probably already all saw this slide. Invasive Species Management 101 teaches us that we need to be proactive. When we're in that bottom left of that chart here is when we're in early stages of invasion, where it's relatively cheap and quick to address the invasion. As we start to lose control, or as annual grasses start to become more well established, we move into a longer term management phase where it's going to be more costly, and it's going to take a longer time to see that success. Next slide, please. So issues are also informed by the landscape ecology. You know, context matters. As a blue landowner on the left side of this image, surrounded by red representing the annual grass infested areas, we can try as hard as we want and stay after it, and we can probably keep our square blue, but we're always going to have to be working after it. And that's not the fault of the landowners around us. That's the nature of invasive annual grasses, is they are persistent. However, if we were to be a red square on the right and we wanted to get rid of our invasion, our odds of success are much higher because we are already surrounded in the landscape context of relatively uninvaded rangelands. So if we concentrate our effort on expanding those blues, we can start to convert an entire grid to blue and only have to move red square to red square and not have to look back and retreat. If you want to go to the next slide, please. And then common sense teaches us that teamwork matters. So however you want to say it, teamwork makes the dream work, whatever. The whole is greater than some of the parts. We all have quotes like these pounded into our head, but how we engage in teamwork also matters. It's not just that we're on a team, it's that we're on a team playing together. So if you were to liken this for another metaphor is shifting our focus from being an Easter egg hunt, dashing out and trying to find all these problems and fix them, to a football team. We are all trying to move the ball down the field. So this team of agencies and partners came together, and I stress this, in person to figure out how to move the needle. What are we all doing cumulatively across the board, and what could we all be doing together? And I stress the in-person meetings is because it is really important, as we've learned and we've seen from all of our discussions today included, is to have that interaction of not just what's on the agenda, but the sidebars, the building the trust, the understanding why we're doing what we're doing. And so, like I said, we've had in-person meetings, a half a dozen or more over the past year, and they're regularly scheduled, where we talk about what are the projects we see on the horizon, who are landowners that we see that are in the context of our landscape, BLM, Forest Service, private land, and how can we engage everybody, state lands. I think I saw at least a half a dozen of the people in this slide represented in our attendees list today. If you could go to the next slide. So one of the conversation starters, or one of the things that got us talking all on the same page, was this Rangeland Analysis platform produced by Brady Allred and Matt Jones out of the University of Montana. And what this is it's remote sensing data that that is trained by on-the-ground data from BLM and NRCS, and it's trained by year. And so we have pretty reliable data on what's on the ground, and we can scale that up. And so we can see in the right side of this image is we can actually start to color code our maps by our percent cover of annual forbs and grasses, perennial forbs and grasses, shrubs and trees. And we can start to actually see a more landscape context of areas where we might want to consider working. Next slide, please. So from that previous exercise of seeing that landscape context, we saw that we could combine the concepts of invasive species management, landscape ecology, and teamwork, and put them into a proactive spatial strategy. Instead of just always reacting to where cheatgrass is bad, we're now able to find those places that are still relatively intact, address them, and keep them that way. That way, we can then move forward out into areas that maybe need a little bit more attention and not have to look back over our shoulder and see if we need to retreat an area we just finished. We know that preventative care is less expensive and more successful than an emergency room care. The example here showing it's much cheaper and much easier to go to a doctor and hear some inconvenient news than be in an emergency room. If we start somewhere intact or vulnerable, we can achieve some control and feel more confident that we step out and don't have to look back and re-engage. For those of you who are familiar with the recent massive lift with conifers, this would be similar to starting in a phase 1 and pushing towards a phase 3. The difference now is we're in slightly less charismatic. You can really see a landscape change with junipers, or conifers, excuse me. So next slide, please. So we used the Rangeland Analysis platform to identify relatively intact core areas with lower cover of annuals, and identify transition zones where shrublands are actively shifting to annuals at large scales. Large areas dominated by moderate to high annuals were characterized as our annual grass region. And we can kind of see that division in the green being our core, yellows and oranges are transition, and our red is a relatively stable state. And you'll notice in the left-hand picture of Idaho, there's some white spots. Those are large areas of urban development and agriculture that we excluded from the map. On the right, we can see what fed this map is that conflict map of our red zones in the right map are actually areas that are transitioning. Our blue areas are stable. And so we can use that data to say, okay, where is our conflict? What direction is our spread going? And how do we engage? Next slide, please. So the core area represents regionally intact rangelands as characterized by low cover of annual grasses. Local areas of higher annual grass cover may be present within the region, but the overall invasion is still relatively low. So this is that left-hand curve of the Invasive Management 101, where local management in these areas is more likely to be effective at maintaining sagebrush rangelands in the long run because of the already favorable landscape context. The annual grass region, that red zone, just the other end of the spectrum, this region is primarily along the Snake River Plain. It's dominated by moderate to high cover of annual grasses. Some rangelands may have converted to an annual grassland state where they're stable as an annual grassland. Doesn't necessarily mean desirable, excuse me. Local areas of lower annual grass cover may be present within the region, but their long-term integrity is compromised by occurring in a setting of higher invasive annuals. Again, these would be those red square or blue squares surrounded by red squares. Frequent fires and reinvasion from neighboring areas make maintenance of sagebrush rangelands extremely difficult in this context. And then in between the core and the annual grass region is, again, the transition zone. Those are areas those are areas that are considered to be undergoing ecosystem state changes at landscape scales where there's more variability of dominance of annuals versus dominant of natives and shrublands. But these are the important battle fronts for stemming annual grass conversion, while also being areas of high unpredictability for management due to the rapid change that is going on. A disturbance could really dictate which way the needle turns. So our team developed this strategy of defending the core, which is to defend those green areas from annual grass conversion as our top priority for management, anchoring our efforts where we can win easily and then move out. These are areas where it's lower investment, early and aggressive control through the eradication of invasives and promotion of perennial grasses. Those are areas where we may have to revisit, but our investment is significantly lower than other regions. The next strategy is to grow the core. While cores are being defended, a secondary priority is to push outward. Sustained effort, including large-scale restoration, is needed in these areas to halt that push of cheatgrass into the cores. However, having anchored at the core, we can now push out. And then finally is the mitigate impacts. We're not walking away from the annual grass regions. They will still be on the radar of all land management agencies and private landowners. But we need to think about what tools we use to mitigate the most severe impacts of the cheatgrass fire cycle, particularly. Primary actions in this region may include just asset protection, fine fuels reduction, and rehabilitation and maintenance of perennial grasses. Next slide, please. So, of course, we need to further prioritize where to work, and that's up to our local stakeholders and partners to prioritize that. We have this satellite imagery and we have these high elevation concepts of our landscapes, but it's a team of about 12 people that are expected to know the whole state, and that's certainly never going to be the case. We defer to our local level stakeholders and partners to inform us of issues that maybe we haven't seen yet. And so there's a ton of information that you might want to pull into that our stakeholders feed us: local knowledge, vegetation data, resource values, risk maps, that resistance resilience mapping, sage-grouse priority areas, big game habitat, you name it. Any information that helps us refine where we need to go next. And then concentrating management in specific geographies also helps us make measurable outcomes more likely, as opposed to that shotgun approach, postage stamp ideas. When we can start to block up land, regardless of ownership, that we're working in, our odds of success go up and our price tag generally goes down. Next slide, please. And this is probably old hat to a lot of folks, is this isn't just eradicating invasive annuals. This isn't a one and done. We're also managing for perennials, whether that's through seeding or just altered grazing systems, you name it, whatever we can do to also manage for perennials. Next slide, please. And so this is an example of what actions our land managers can take, and often what discussions that we have in these meetings is, where are we in those early transition stages where we can be doing prevention, early detection and rapid response, get out, address the problem and move on. What areas are more suited for restoration and management, where we need to be aggressive post-fire, get in, get some native seed in the ground and monitor those areas. And then containment and mitigation. Again, this would fall more in the annual grass region, where we're looking at fine fuels reduction through strategic grazing or fuel breaks or large scale thinning projects, what have you. Next slide, please. So what does success look like? Well, first of all, it's setting realistic expectations and timeframes for recovery of desired conditions. And that's essential because this is a long-term commitment. This isn't a one and done. We're going to have to keep with it. Much like conifer removal, as I said earlier, when you cut those trees, there's still seeds in the ground that are going to come up. When we address invasive annuals, there's still seeds in the ground that are going to come up. So we emphasize that we have to stick with this. We need long-term funding and we need long-term commitments from all of our partners. We emphasize that stakeholders can really help with coordination and prioritization and getting large-scale demonstrations going. Again, success will be based on the proof that we bring to the table. Additionally, successes can be measured, excuse me, as financial buy-in by partner agencies. So far, we've leveraged nearly $1 million for our initial rollout, and we're optimistic of opportunities, but certainly aware that we've attracted attention and we need to prove our concept. So this is year one of our rollout. As I mentioned earlier, the agencies meet regularly. Project applications for this year are due on May 15th, the end of next week, at which point, again, the stakeholders, the partners in the Cheatgrass Challenge committee will get together. We'll figure out what projects we can fund, how they fit in the landscape context, and where we can go from there. And hopefully by this time next year, we'll have reportables of how working together across fence lines and meeting and discussing projects regularly, hopefully we'll be discussing how that's been a win for us. So if you want to go to the next slide again, please. So I just want to reiterate, a shared vision of addressing the problem of invasive annual grasses isn't new, but how we address the problem as a collective unit of agencies and partners is. All the agencies listed here meet regularly to address what we're doing to address cheatgrass so that we can prevent opportunities from falling through the cracks. We discuss what everybody knows is going on and where maybe we could build on a project. Next slide, please. And so I want to conclude, hopefully I'm slightly ahead of schedule, but I want to conclude with a quote from Aldo Leopold. I listened carefully for clues whether the West has accepted cheat as a necessary evil, to be lived with until kingdom come, or whether it regards cheat as a challenge to rectify its past errors in land use. I found the hopeless attitude almost universal. There is, as yet, no sense of shame in the proprietor of a sick landscape. Now, those are strong words, but I think those are meant more of as a challenge, and I certainly interpret them as a challenge of proving Mr. Leopold wrong and saying, we're still fighting this battle years after he's said that quote, but we have every intention of winning, and we're at least going to give it all we've got. We certainly haven't, we've certainly taken ownership of the issue. And with that, I think there's one last slide, some links to some of the data, the resources, the Idaho Cheatgrass Challenge landing page, which can be found on the NRCS website, the Rangeland Analysis platform, and some Idaho-specific cover from the Rangeland Analysis platform that gave us that core transition and annual grass and zones. And I think with that, I could probably have a little time for questions.
Yes, you definitely can have time for questions. Thank you very much, Charlie. That was informative, and it was entertaining, I have to say. So you met the mark on as far as that goes. We have several questions submitted, so I know we can at least get to a handful of these. The first is from Jill Randall. How was soil data used and incorporated into the regional team priorities? Is it different than R&R mapping?
So we definitely use both. The R&R mapping gives us a kind of a coarse scale, kind of like the RAP map of understanding landscapes and where they fit on the spectrum of R&R. But as applications come in from those local groups, generally NRCS focus groups or landowners or fishing game, as those applications come in, we also look at soil classifications and understanding what we are capable of achieving so that we don't set our expectations not necessarily too high, but in the wrong spot. Understanding where we are and where we need to go based on what the soil will let us do.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Another question, this one from John O'Keefe. You said get some native seed in the ground. Do you see a role for non-native, and parentheses, crested wheat?
That's a loaded question. You know, there's a time and a place for everything. I think that might be most appropriate to leave it at that. It all depends on what the land management, the landowners' priorities are and their objectives are. We know that cheatgrass and Medusa head and ventonata are threats to our systems. And if there are landowners whose priorities don't align with ours, we assess and determine next steps.
All right, thank you. Let's see, Dolly Edmonds submitted, this is exciting. How will you be reaching out to let stakeholders know about your successes and lessons learned? What outreach strategy do you have planned?
So we are graced by cooperating with the NRCS as almost a hosting agency. We are graced to have their public relations staff, as well as most agencies, excuse me, participating agency staff, to help roll out those success stories. Hopefully we'll have this conversation next year or one similar to it where we can roll this out. I know that there is also the Sage West email listserv that we can share successes. Right now we're focused on rolling it out. And so hopefully by this time that will be a question that is very pressing to us. Great.
I think we might be able to get at least another one or two in. This next one from Ali Duval. Charlie and community, super great presentation. The Idaho Cheatgrass Challenge is a brilliant state-led collaborative initiative that we can all support and learn from. My question, if large-scale demonstration projects are needed, can you elaborate on where and when, or pardon me, on where and what is needed to make this happen?
So Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, so when we think of large scale demonstration, one of the key things about demonstration is it needs to be accessible. When we take folks out to show them a win, is we need to be able to go somewhere that isn't going to be super remote or difficult to drive to, and at a scale where we can really take in the context. But that's dependent on, much of this program is voluntary. So that's dependent on whether or not we have landowner investment, neighboring state BLM, Forest Service investment. And so these all factors are cumulative that'll tell us where these projects are. You know, certainly that core area and that transition zone would be great to see a conversion from the yellow, the transition to a green, somewhere where we can show it off quickly and easily. But the willingness of the landowners will be what dictates that.
Okay, thank you. We have actually more questions than we can get to, so we're going to have a couple that we will save for you, Charlie, but maybe the last one, because it could be particularly instructive for the breakout groups next week. How did you deal with the funding from different agencies, and were you able to pool the dollars?
So yes and no on the pooling of the funds. There are certain funds that we can't pool. For instance, the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have partners for fish and wildlife funds that we can commit to private landowners in a project in the context of a larger project, but we can't just put it into the bank account with another project. So we've also applied for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's Sagebrush Ecosystems Grant, which is a little bit more of a pooled fund. It's got NRCS and BLM funds in it, where we can more readily leverage funds across land ownerships. But part of this committee is understanding, part of the Cheatgrass Challenge team is understanding where we have those issues and where maybe someone says, okay, I can pay for this chunk, well, we can pay for this chunk, and then stitching those together where necessary.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Charlie. Sure appreciate it. And again, very thought-provoking things that I'm sure will come up in the discussion next week with the breakout groups on invasive species. So thanks again.
You bet.
We are going to go ahead. Oh, and again, for folks that ask questions that I didn't get to bring to Charlie, we will circle back with him and see if we can get a response to you, and then make sure that we get that posted on the website as well.